hours at COP, right? Maybe that's the best answer. That's fed up with everything, right? That was the picture for realism, and that was the 3 COPs, and that was the Montreal Protocol, just the headline. And as you can see, we've had a series of climate COPs through time. I'll jump straight through. Just mentioned Paris. So what was the objective? Underlined in red: stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So that was thinking, here we are in the early 90s, thinking, let's not get to a dangerous level. Obviously, we've missed that. We are way beyond dangerous already. But we're now at a stage of let's prevent disastrous, I would say. We haven't worded it that way, but let's prevent disastrous.
Can I ask through photogenic, just
human caused climate. So as a paleoclimatologist, I can tell you there's an awful lot of changes in the Earth's climate throughout time. The human causes of the current one are clearly established with science. So that was the thing. Let's not let it get too bad. So and to put this in perspective, since the early 90s, we have emitted half as much again. So half of our total emissions have happened since the early 90s. So we've made the problem twice as bad since that statement. Which is why you can have people legitimately saying, is this COP process doing any good at all? That's the graph of CO2 levels in the atmosphere as measured in Hawaii. We've increased by about a third since the Paris Agreement. Anyway, let's talk about what actually happens in a negotiation. First off, this is a group that I helped make happen, which is a group of observers. In the middle there, one of our leaders, actually, Laura Young, who grew up in Renfrew, and Scottish influencer of the year this year. So she's a great one to follow. Let's waste Laura. But we've grabbed through an application process a number of people from, I think, 7 or 8 different countries who seem to be on a climate trajectory of some sort, and for whom a visit to a COP, well curated, could be very beneficial. So that's the Christian Climate Observers Program. It's a coalition of agencies that have badges. Show your badge. There you go. So they give you this as an observer. It gives you access to various parts of the COP, but not all parts. Right, so what happens? Obviously, you have negotiations. These are on maybe 4 or 5 dozen different tracks at any one time, where people are trying to work it out. Yes. It's a really large number. Some get the headlines, some don't. But that'll be one negotiation going on. And these are often done by groups. So that was in Glasgow, actually. Gabon there was speaking on behalf of the so-called G77 and China group. At one stage, you had 77 nations in them. It's now 139 plus China. So you get groups coalescing around a common theme to try to negotiate. Otherwise, it would take literally forever if every country said the same thing. You also have behind closed doors meetings, ones which you know nothing about, are often convened by the presidency. It's a very important job being in the presidency and hosting it. I believe that the UK did fairly well at that, to be honest, when we hosted. Not really sure about the current one. Then when they've negotiated a text to a certain point, they come together, they gather everybody and say, we'll have a plenary. You have 3,000 people in the room, including a handful of observers. And they literally, any nation can say, we don't agree with this text, we do agree with that. And that's where the presidency tries to get a feel for how much of a consensus there is. You don't have to have uniformity, you don't have everybody agreeing, but the sense of consensus is around what would get through or what would be blocked. So it's a very delicate operation, really, being a president. So here's an example of a plenary where they had just passed in COP28, they'd passed the global stocktake text. The very next moment, the small island states chimed in saying, well, we weren't in the room when that was passed. We wouldn't have blocked it, but we have these observations. So it's not a very fair process.
Why weren't they?
Well, it's not really clear why they weren't in. They were actually held by security. So we don't know if that was stage managed or if it was just nobody was getting in at that point. And they were late because they were working out the exact text they wanted to protest about. Also in a COP, very importantly, you have a lot of side events. And I would say probably about a third of all the effort in a COP is these interested parties, different nations, different businesses, different groups talking about different issues and coming together around solutions and ways forwards. And they're really, really productive. A lot of good work happens. That was about water. This one here was me actually included in one in the faith pavilion. We're talking about hope, we're talking about optimism and the different ingredients of that in a faith context. Lady to my left is from a Pacific island. I think Samoa, it was Samoa. And then a Hindu lady and a guy from Jerusalem. So interesting dialogue we were able to have. We wouldn't have had it if we weren't all in the COP. Then a lot of really good science gets reported. If you have the time, which of course most of the negotiators don't, you can really catch up on the latest science. Cryosphere is the Cryosphere Pavilion is that group. That is the study of ice in your like biospheres or atmospheres. And guess what? Wherever you look in climate science, as we study it more deeply, we find the problems are coming earlier than we'd hoped they would. You always, back in the 90s when I was a PhD student, you'd say, well, it might be this bad, it might not be, maybe it'll be around here. And as we've looked into it in more detail, we always find that the impacts are coming at an earlier stage of warming. I'm afraid I don't have anything good to say from a climate science point of view. So then also wonderful things happen. Like you bump into people. This is an old friend from when I was doing my PhD. He's now a professor at UCL. By the way, I'm not in an academic position. Just so you know, if you want someone from a university, that's different. But I'm highly qualified as a climate communicator. That's why I'm here. And guess who I met? The Quaker observer, Lindsay. And we were at the last plenary. Actually, had a great chat about different things. So obviously the Quakers do great things in observing, including actually in the scientific body. They have observer status at the IPCC, which is an unusual thing for any organization to have. Yeah, and you can definitely get meetings that would never happen otherwise. This young man from the States last year had been on the metro with me, who was in my mentoring group, and I said, if you want to meet somebody, don't consider yourself small, consider yourself as somebody who has authority, as an observer. And he bumped into his senator and grabbed the moment, and is now in an ongoing relationship, helping them to work with faith groups in his part of the States to promote climate action. So things happen, particularly our African participants. They manage to meet people who they never would have met otherwise, and it really builds their NGO and their local initiatives. So often that step up really, really helps. Just be aware that the actual negotiations go through the night from day one. And you can see here a couple of guys fast asleep. It is very common by the middle of the COP to see negotiators flat out asleep. So hats off to them. You really hope they can still make good decisions at that point. So let's look at COP29. Yes, Baku, you know, lots and lots of fancy skyscrapers. They never build a straight skyscraper in these countries anymore. If you have enough money, you can make a wavy skyscraper. And these three are extremely beautiful, to be honest, the so-called flames. Guess what they're the headquarters for? The oil company. Yes, they are. So, interesting as you walk around the streets. We were staying in a fairly cheap place sort of away from the main town centre. No skyscrapers there. But guess what? Wherever you look, the natural gas supply is walking down the streets with you. And you can see where they've patched it. There is a thing in emissions studies where you're looking at something called fugitive emissions. So that's stuff which is basically escaping from pipework. The fugitive emissions for the Russian Federation accounts for about 1% of total global emissions. It keeps saying, I've said it since Glasgow, this would be a low-hanging fruit. If we could just fix that, would be all right. They fixed some, but there's a lot that still needs fixing. Yes, fancy skyscrapers. And yeah, this was hardly free from controversy from day one. I'm very glad that they called the chief negotiator of Azerbaijan, saying, well, we can just have a negotiation on oil. And an awful lot of backroom deals would have included oil deals. They were there in the same place. That's going to happen. The fact that then the president comes up on day 1 or 2 and says, it's a gift from God to have oil and gas, makes me think of various theological explorations about what you do with gifts and how you handle them, what you're responsible for. Yes, he needs a bit of that, I would say. It's been very belligerent since. And a very large number of people who could be traced to be from oil and gas organisations. It would have formed the 4th largest group. Question?
Was there any embarrassment about being caught doing these negotiations, or indeed about making the statement, the gift from God?
I don't think there's any embarrassment about making the statement, it's a gift from God. I don't think there's any, I don't know if they are embarrassed. They've been very defensive. My hunch, knowing a bit about the cultures, because I've worked in various cultures a bit similar, is they'll be a bit embarrassed about being caught, but not about having broken the spirit of hosting a COP. Yeah. Don't forget, last year something similar happened. The UAE were caught doing oil deals on the back of having to do with diplomacy to set up the COP. So, yes.
Did they host any of these side events at all, these fossil fuel companies?
Coming to that a little bit,
Okay.
yeah. So, an awful lot of the wealth in Azerbaijan is from oil. It's around about 50% of GDP, it's 90% of exports. So, in some calculations, it's the most dependent on oil of any economy in the world. Right, arriving at the COP with these wonderful buses, some of which are electric, brand new, apparently imported last month. Some were diesel, some were CNG. But the site, you couldn't make it up. The site is next to an oil processing plant. As you get off the bus, you can smell the sulfur. So just zooming in on this oil plant, look. They have painted wind turbines on the oil storage tanks and planted fast-growing trees to shield them from us. Yes.
How is Azerbaijan chosen? How do they choose?
Oh, fair question. So under the UNFCCC, the location rotates in different regions, and it had to be Eastern Europe.
Right.
Well, Eastern Europe meant, and every country has to agree to it. So Russia would have vetoed any country supporting Ukraine. We probably wouldn't have wanted it in Ukraine. So that left a tiny handful of countries. And it was agreed halfway through COP28. Right, so I'm just going to flip through how much fossil fuel influence you have. And these are the various pavilions. There must be about 400 pavilions, different countries, different organizations, and so on. And this is just a few of them I found who were obviously promoting fossil fuels in various ways. The OPEC Fund. Yes, of course, we will help you. A lot of it will be helping you develop the fossil fuels. The GECF, that's, I can't remember what it was now. Anyway, natural gas for sustainable development is their slogan. Gas exporting countries for that's who it was. So they will have gathered together for those who are reliant on exporting gas and talk about how wonderful it is. Of course, it does bring benefits. It's time to move on. That's not going. Okay, I'm not getting this changing on the screen. The next one is going to be Namibia, a major oil and gas hosting country. I'm hoping this is going to catch up, saying they're becoming the sustainable energy capital of Africa.
Sounds sustainable.
Sustainable in there, well, there's lots of different ways you can use sustainable. Never a technical problem. Thank you. Back on. Hopefully. Oh, share. Good. It's looking hopeful. From current slide. Good. Right, so that's Manibri again. Right, Qatar, some of the biggest pavilions and the most expensive ones. But look at the guys in there. There are about 3 women and about 80 men. Yes, okay. Natural gas at the heart of food security. So that's using the fact that you use natural gas to make artificial fertilizers. Yeah, okay, you can argue, but it's for food security. There are other ways to get fertilizers. Who was that? That's a GCF. I haven't gone backwards. Right. Anyway, so I think we're okay. There is a lot of fossil fuel influence. Can you get rid of it? Well, you need every country at the table. We're going to come by the end about whether there is a need to rejig the table. Right. So what's the finance COP? And what does that mean? And this is an important set of background really for why it was as it is. So the thinking was you've got 3 COPs from last year, this year, and the future one to rejig world's direction on climate. Last year was the global stock take. So that's the first, under the Paris Agreement, the first time when they took an overall stock take of where we were going. Obviously, we're off track from keeping well below 2 degrees, which was the Paris Agreement. Well, and pursue efforts to keep to 1.5. Yeah. Then this year was to launch a new collective quantified goal, NCQG, on finance. So that's, we'll go into that in a minute, to what that is, to get us ready for next year when the new set of NDCs, so everybody's declared aims as a nation of how they're going to reduce emissions. So can you see you can't have the NDCs really without the finance. And the finance was, and the Paris Agreement realized, and everyone signed up to this, you can't have all nations involved in trying to reduce emissions without the richer nations and the historic emitters supporting the transitions for poorer countries. Otherwise, it can't work because poorer countries would have gone through a high emission process. Instead, we're hoping they can leapfrog it. So it's important not to think of this as international aid. It's not really, especially if targeted right. It's a process of collective self-interest. So the new quantified goal on climate finance was what was being negotiated through most of the COP and was really the most important thing to go on, not the only thing. And as I said, the Paris Agreement expected that. And you've got 3 categories really of finance: mitigation, so that's reducing emissions; adaptation, that's adapting what you have to the new climate realities; and then loss and damage, which is in the Paris Agreement, it's very specific. That's around bits of your cultural or your nation which are destroyed by climate impacts, and you're never going to get them back. And so that's more close to a reparations scenario. But that's your 3. And you can actually set up a kind of equation here. The more mitigation we do, the less adaptation we'll need to do, and the less loss and damage or suffering will happen, and vice versa. It's an important truism to have in mind, really. So there was this report about raising ambition and accelerating delivery of climate finance, came out just before COP. One of the authors, Nicholas Stern, who is quite well known as a brilliant economist and has written the Stern report, 30 years ago in the UK, basically saying you will save money by reducing emissions. In the long term, it's vastly cheaper to take climate action than not to. So he's one of several authors here, and they said it would be an absolute minimum of 1.3 trillion per year of funding to help, let's say, poorer nations transition. And that was kind of what we should be aiming at. And it sounds like a huge sum of money. Let's look at what that would actually be, because it's not just an increase in foreign aid budget. Although the bottom tier there is public finance. But if you get that right, then it will open up more private finance and multilateral development banks like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank. And then you get more contributors from not just historic emitters, but also hopefully China maybe, Saudi maybe, the UAE is now contributing. And so you're not just dealing with the limited funds that you're going to get from the EU or the States or wherever, but hopefully more. And then added, ultimately, this should leverage private finance. So it's quite complicated, but how you do this matters an awful lot. And how
But
big.
they didn't agree on how much would be grant and how much would be
Come in a minute. Yeah. So try to picture, this was actually, one of my friends mocked up this image based on what the representative from Panama said. But it's not that much, actually. 1.3 trillion sounds ridiculous to me. It is, of course, a huge amount of money. How about 7 trillion of global fossil fuel subsidies per year? That's an IMF figure. It's quite well established. US COVID relief spending was 4.5 trillion. I think the UK's was about 3 trillion in my head. So it's a huge sum of money. Defence spending, 2.4 trillion per year. So let alone if you look at the combined wealth of billionaires. Yes. So it's a lot of money. And yet, if you add up all the costs, even this year, of climate disasters, it could well be $1 trillion. They think probably the 2 major hurricanes impacted the States will be about 800 billion in costs. So, yeah, it might be a bargain, actually. Doesn't mean you can get people to pay it, but conceptually, it's quite a good idea. So they kept publishing different editions of the text of what this new, I'm going to get it wrong, but the new deal on finance would be. And every time a new text came out, it was a tiny amount, say 180 billion or 250 billion. And at this stage, last few days of the COP, when I was there, then you'd get different countries or organizations briefing saying, this is ridiculous. Bolivia said, this is not even a joke. This is an insult. But he's very good at his language, the guy from Bolivia. And while these kind of briefings would go on in the corridors, behind closed doors, they were trying to thrash out what to do. And finally, we were there at the final gathering, which was very early morning on a Sunday morning. The thing was supposed to have finished on a Friday night. And he just said, this is it, agreed. So I'm just going to tell you what happened next as an observer. What happened next was everyone clapped, said, yeah, brilliant, we've done it, hooray, fantastic. India wants the floor. India's the first one to say, we just don't agree with anything you've said, and we were not consulted, and we were told we would have the floor. We haven't had it, you've gabbled it through before anyone agreed. So it was a bit mayhem, really. This is word for word tweeted at the time. India does not accept the proposal in its current form, even though it's just been adopted. A mere $300 billion by 35, 11 years later, the goal is too little, too distant. She was furious. She wasn't the only one. There were about 7 other speakers who got on. Nigeria was very clear as well. This is just so much less than what we will need. Well, in The Guardian 3 days ago, the COP president has basically laid bare an awful lot of what he reports as being part of the negotiations, which incidentally you're not supposed to do as a COP president. You're supposed to keep it. You're supposed to be able to hold it. And he blamed Western countries for delaying his ability to put out the text at different stages. What I'm trying to say is this was a very, very convoluted and poor process. And it's not surprising, but many people are really, really very annoyed. English understatement at what happened. Well, thinking about timing, if we wanted to go into detail, we could just look at one or two of the actual aspects of this. There is another whole thing I want to go into around finance. So I might flip through, I'll do two of these, so you get the idea of what we have, and then I'll flip through the others, and we can do that later if we want to. So, paragraph 5, the new dollars will help developing countries hit their NDCs of 2035. Good, so that's in the text. This is what the money is for. All these would have been negotiated. Urgent need to reform a global financial system to aid poorer countries. There are lots of ways in which the global financial system really hinders things at the moment. And the people to watch on that is Barbados, with their Bridgetown initiatives around rejigging it. Lots of wonderful ideas. You just have to get on and do them.
What's the ideas?
Well, I'll talk later on. There's a call for all countries and institutions to deliver 1.3 trillion by 2035. So at least they got in that as a goal, even though it was a 300 billion per year by 2035 that's actually committed. Right, I'm not going to go through all the others, but can you see that you have a lot of stuff? And I need to, where's my... So the credit there, I've taken that straight from Ed King's email, just so you know, because he'd done the hard work of selecting what was what. So save some time. Right, now I'm going to talk about mitigation, which is the first one. Let's reduce emissions. And if you remember, last year's UAE consensus agreed several things: transition away from fossil fuels and energy systems. Quite a specific area, but that's the first time they said we will be transitioning away. It's a great achievement to have that in the main text. Also, to triple renewable energy and double energy efficiency. There were other bits in there, but these three are the important ones. Everyone got pushed back really hard at by various countries. Are going to talk about that now. So here's an example. Halfway through the COP, it's easy to forget, but the core purpose of the UN climate talks, written into the original deal, is to see emissions stabilised at a safe level. Late on Saturday, that in fact seemed to be lost as governments debated a proposal to freeze mitigation work programme, which is a COP26 outcome, by the way, mitigation work programme. Freeze it in Baku under a Rule 16 motion, punting those talks to next year. Saudi Arabia, India, Iran, and Bolivia were among those urging for these talks to be suspended. They faced off against Colombia, Chile, small island states, UK, Japan, and Norway. It's like the geopolitics of this was enormous this year. So they very nearly stopped talking about mitigation altogether. And Bolivia's argument was, unless you're going to give us a good deal on finance, we are not going to talk about it. It was like, she gets it. It was like a hostage, holding mitigation as a hostage. Unbelievable. I was really shocked when I read that Monday morning.
Where's Saudi Arabia on that? That's kind of weird. Yeah.
Here's Saudi Arabia. Details reported in the New York Times, and that they were going through the text, removing references to mitigation left, right, and centre. Right. As an observer, and a network of observers, we were finding exactly the same things. This is Laura's also campaigned on disposable vapes, so that's our best picture of that. She said in every negotiation she was in, Saudi were being difficult, supported by China, often sat side by side, which makes the optics more powerful. Mostly in the form of wanting complete paragraphs removed, with little or no compromise suggested. Natalie Jones finding the same thing. She's a carbon brief reporter. Also saw that there was a tax on the UAE dialogue. decision. That was another one set up last year to every year report back on the mitigation process based on the UAE dialogue. I had two friends who were in this negotiation as well, and they said that Saudi Arabia would say, no, we don't want that paragraph at all. And then finally, they said, no, all we have to do is report. So we're just going to say we met. We're not going to say what we talked about, but we didn't agree or anything. And the UK would push back saying, no, really, we could at least report that we didn't agree on these points. So it was a stonewalling effort, really horrible. And ultimately it was pushed back to next year. So just a few more details then on what people have proposed in terms of mitigation to get onto the final text. As you can see at the end, none of these were actually adopted. So could we say, reaffirms call on parties to contribute to efforts referred to in paragraph 28 of the decision, which is the UAE consensus. How about we could say, we can have new targets for enhanced global energy storage and grid capacity. I mean, that's a no-brainer. People are doing it anyway because it's financially sensible. They're building one up from me in Paisley, a huge grid battery, because it makes money. Can we do an annual report on global progress towards implementation of paragraph 28? Right, all these were rejected because you have this consensus arrangement. Now, I can't go into every single detail, but that is the kind of detail of people trying to insert things into the text at least to go forwards. And in the end, it feels like we only just kept last year's level of ambition on mitigation, and we very nearly lost it. So another note, I didn't have permission from her to quote her, so I haven't put a name up, but she's a scientist that's in the negotiations, reminding of the science all the time. And her observation was, the process was designed for honest actors. We have others right now. I think a lot of them were really shocked at how far from the traditional sort of, let's at least look like we're trying kind of negotiations. And so you have various people signing a letter halfway through the COP saying it's not really fit for purpose anymore. It was designed to establish an international agreement. Now we're on to how we implement it. Maybe we need to rejig it to make that work. Clarification from one of the signatories, that was Christiana Figueres. She said, no, it's not that we want to dismantle the COP process, it just does need a rejigging, because otherwise the blocking that's still possible within that consensus arrangement is too powerful and it's blocking us from moving forwards. Well, my conclusions really are that what we do in an evening like tonight in the Climate Cafe, or what we managed to do with these various observers from different countries, that was our dinner in the middle of the COP. You can see the different nations involved there. It's actually an awful lot of the best work is always going to be on small scale, in small scale. And it's always going to be local homes. It was the point I tried to make in the few minutes I had. She wants to talk, this is the minister. But I just said, look, the important thing I can bring is that you've got to help the grassroots group work well. You can't just fund lots of heat pumps and people fit bad ones. You've got to have the experienced people on the ground working out how to do it, which is what local homes is so good for. So that said, you have to have the big scale as well. And let's hope that Brazil next year does an awful lot better at hosting than we have this year. I'm not that impressed by what we saw in terms of the presidency. Yeah. That's what we got. Thank you. I'll stop sharing. So, questions, people?
Do you think they're going to have to move away from this idea of consensus, that they're going to have some form
right.
of thing?
Many people have said we should move away from consensus. The problem is that to change the system into a voting system, you have to have a consensus decision.
Yeah.
So how can you do that? Another whole load of things that happen at COP are outside of the UNFCCC. So you have coalitions of countries coming together to agree certain things. I mean, at Glasgow, we had the Beyond coal, or Powering Beyond Coal Alliance, which keeps growing. Indonesia at this COP committed to retiring all their coal-fired power stations in the next 15 years. They're part of that group. So you do have things which aren't on the every single country agreeing to it kind of level. Those things are good. Can we ever get to not having a consensus? I don't know.
If you didn't have a consensus, how would you get any action from the people who disagreed?
Yes. But they're not doing it anyway. Question?
This is a really naive question. As an observer, what is the rationale behind the UAE, for example? I mean, that's a country that's going to be decimated by climate change.
I have no idea. It's like they managed to get Saudi Arabia to sign up to their deal last year. I guess because of national pride. Come on, we've got to show that we Arabs can do something, or something a bit like that. And then within a week, Saudi Arabia was briefing against it. So all through the year, they've been trying to dismantle what they had agreed to. It's not that clear to me. There will be people who know more about geopolitics. Equally, it's not that clear what China was playing at this time. And somewhere in there, Russia was playing a game, and we don't know what. Because Azerbaijan is very close to Russia.
Why do they think? Why do the Saudis think they're going to be okay? That's the thing.
That's a really interesting question. And who's the anthropologist here? Yeah, is the anthropology of thinking you'll be fine because you can just keep going with your air conditioning. And I did chat with several of them last year, and they just don't get the science. They're not people who've grown up understanding that they do rely on more than their own little bubble. That's my assessment of it. Well, you get plenty of people in the UK who don't think that either. It's helpful having a geography degree where you've studied that there's a water system and that water comes from the oceans and all that sort of thing. People who haven't got that in their thinking, it's really hard to imagine that you driving your car, your petrol car, is going to cause generations of mayhem. Now, that's honestly, that's a hard ask. Therefore, the international diplomacy, I think, has to work in other ways of mutual self-interest to persuade them. So they won't do it for the rationale of this is going to hurt us too, because it's not in their thinking enough. Yeah, you have to find other ways.
Can we ask if there's anyone on Zoom that wants to raise a point or ask a question? Susan?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I was at a talk a few years ago by the former UK ambassador for climate change, Professor Sir David King, who was lecturing a bunch of oil executives in Aberdeen about melting ice caps in Greenland. It was quite an interesting event. But he said that the British government had worked with some counterparts in both the Indian and the Chinese government. I don't know at what level, but he says the people that at the level that they talked to in China had recognized that a lot of people dying from heat waves in China. Climate change could have really serious impacts on China. Some of the biggest cities are by the coasts and threatened by rising sea levels. It could threaten their food production, and a heat wave could be quite devastating to large chunks of their population. I also know from my own sort of work in the electricity industry that China is deploying a lot of renewables, maybe not in the way that we would, but they are getting on and building lots of groundbreaking stuff. So I'm really disappointed to hear that they were playing this game.
Yeah, it's very hard to read China. My hunch is, and you're right, that they have this huge clean tech industry. They are looking now to export that left, right, and centre. They will, and they're probably going to have peaked emissions either this year or next year because of the huge deployment of renewable energy. They deploy more than the rest of the world combined, and they're burning less coal than they did last. Even though they keep opening new coal-fired power stations. That's always the headlines. But they're actually burning less coal. So one way and another, they are close to peaking because of they definitely, enough of them realise that this is a very serious issue for them too. I'm speculating, but with the US essentially off the agenda this year, they were not very active. They couldn't be. But China is sort of jostling for a new position. It probably is something like that. And they've always been key in previous COPs. I listened to a podcast this morning, Outrage and Optimism, if anyone gets it. It's a brilliant podcast. And they were saying from when they were in Copenhagen and several other COPs, China would come up with, oh, we could do this right in the last 2 days. So they play a game, they know what they want to do. And my understanding is they are more aware of the realities of the climate situation than, say, the Saudis. Yeah.
Maybe the USA in the future.
USA is another whole kettle of fish. Yeah.
Why is China still a developing country? That's what I can't understand.
Well, yeah, it doesn't really. So you get certain advantages being called a developing country. So in 1992, yeah, they were a developing country. So they fell under that because they don't want to lose that process. And that also means you can't force them to do climate finance. However, they did an interesting step this year. They declared how much investment they were making into developing countries, which could be classed as climate finance, which is quite a significant amount, actually. That's the first time I've ever declared that. And I think that's them playing a position and game, which we can sort of guess at. Yeah.
But it's partly that about taking resources from the countries where they're investing.
Yeah. China has its own form of colonialism where it buys land and grows food for its people and buys mine sites and uses those resources. Yeah, that's what it does.
I just jump in and say, I think I advertised this event till 8 p.m. So if anyone wants to leave in and out, that's fine. But I think we'll carry on till 8:30.
Yeah.
In 4 minutes.
I wondered how much voice Scotland had in the UK position that was put over at the COP.
Oh, and Laura's very nice and loud. She gets the Scottish point across. I didn't see anybody from Scotland there in week 2.
Nobody at all.
I didn't see anybody. I didn't see any tweets from the Scottish government either. Maybe somebody has other information.
I went to a seminar at Strathclyde University within the last week with Dr. David Joff, the government chief advisor on climate, and I asked about, it was on the decarbonisation of GB energy.
Yes.
And I asked him if there was any differentiation between Westminster and Holyrood. And his precise words were, Holyrood is presently a real pain. Quote.
I don't know what to say to you. It's quite easy to say Westminster's soft and real pain. Okay. That's about forming GB energy, is it? That was the question.
That was decarbonising GB energy.
So GB energy being headquartered in Aberdeen.
No, he wasn't. No, meaning the whole. My other question was about the CGB. What do you do without a CGB? His whole talk was about UK or British energy system.
Yes. That's a big policy effort they're doing.
But it was very Westminster oriented. I mean, extremely Westminster oriented.
Yeah.
Like, well, nobody else really matters.
Sorry. Yeah. It often is.
What's the relationship between WHO and COP?
WHO.
Yeah, I mean, where, did WHO feature at all at the COP?
So last year was the first year they had any particular emphasis on health. I mean, we should understand, probably do that. Climate change is considered the biggest challenge to public health in history, because it affects so many parts of established health. And again, there was some emphasis on health, but not much this time. The WHO has a position in a plenary they can input. I don't know actually what they say.
I didn't see it at all in any of the
Yeah.
at all. It doesn't say anything about epidemics or vaccination programs or polio, I mean, or AIDS. No, it doesn't appear.
Yeah.
Or starvation, obviously.
Yeah, or heat stresses. So I don't know if you dig a bit, particularly on their Twitter or whichever one, you may find that they were giving representations. That's usually where they put out what they did. Yeah.
I mean, sorry, just an added question. There's also nothing I hear there about population. Population sizes.
Population size.
Relationship between population, GDP, and consumption, and climate change.
Yeah.
So,
It doesn't get a mention. And I'm reasonably happy that it doesn't get a mention, because it tends to be associated with nonsense. Because the real problem isn't the total number of people. That is a problem. The real problem is the consumption for very rich people. Because I think it's 50% of all emissions are from, is it 1% of the human population? So this is the big problem. The big problem is that very wealthy people, probably doesn't include all of us in some senses, we're fairly wealthy, but the very, very wealthy people have enormous carbon footprints and are not really aware of it. That's one reason why it's really hard to cut emissions so far. At the same time, they are the people who could themselves reduce emissions through green technologies to quite a large extent, and some of them do.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very important point. It's not the same point as shanty towns, megacities, overcrowding, massive amounts of people, problems about maternal care, midwifery, childcare. I mean, these are massive, huge problems to do with the concentration of population and overpopulation.
And the way that it's managed.
The other bit of that is aging societies, as well as the.
I've not noticed that be featured in any talk, or there's any side event, or any of the text discussion. Yeah, I can't imagine it coming out in multilateral text, because it would be, you've got enough problems between the rich and the poor and the ex-communist and everyone else already that they wouldn't want to touch it. I think.
There's no discussion at all about tackling emissions at the wellhead rather than at the
no, you do. So many oil companies are saying, look, we're reducing the carbon intensity of our oil because we're using solar panels to pump the oil out of the ground.
Yeah,
so that's why UAE have a new NDC, one of 5 countries, including the UK, that publish them, and they talk about this transition, ignoring the fact that they're planning to increase production of oil and gas by 30%. But somebody else is burning it, we don't care.
And that doesn't get included in their NDC.
If you export it, it's not an NDC. Question back.
Do the diplomatic efforts continue all year round? So are there people now working on the attitudes and behaviours of the people who will be negotiating the next time?
Yeah, this is the important thing, actually, is that our assessment is, the people to chat with, is that they didn't do enough diplomacy from this point last year round to the beginning of November to get things ready and see who would be prepared to commit to different texts and what people's red lines were. Didn't help though was the US election coming up. Let's face it, that really didn't help. But I just don't think they had the diplomatic experience. The Paris Agreement was the result of 3 or 4 years of absolutely brilliant diplomacy by the French. COP26. We did about 18 months of it in the middle of a COVID situation and could have done a lot more. But what we did do, collectively, wasn't too disastrous. Could have done more. And if you see what Alok Sharma was doing, he is good at this. My hat's off to him. He should be the UNFCCC General Secretary. So he understands different countries. He appealed to the Indians in the last plenary in Hindi. Please, bitter, please don't do this, because the Indian delegation was suddenly throwing something else into the text. So, there are clearly people who are better at this and not so good. And I don't know enough about Brazil. We will by this time next year, but I don't feel like I know enough about Brazil. There's even political wranglings with Brazil between the previous president and the current president. It could be really difficult. Hand up here.
What can be done about the number of lobbyists?
So my hunch is the only thing we can really do, one of the things we can really do is help British politicians realise there is a significant constituency of people that really, really care about this. The more they feel they have the public behind them, the more they can push internationally. And that's really all we have. So I remember a guy from the US delegation 2 years ago talking to our group, and he said, go home to the Americans, go home and raise the awareness and let everybody communicate to their elected representative that they care about this. Because unless there's a big push from the general population, the politicians won't do what, even if they understand it's the right thing to do, they won't do it unless they feel there's a big push from behind.
Well, when we had COP here, one of the things that I suppose impressed and moved me was, the very young people's contribution. They seem to be very active and they got on the news and that a lot. So maybe that's a way of, and I think young people influencing because they're the ones that are going to suffer really.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of young people who are disengaged now compared to just 4 years ago. It is quite overwhelming. There's definitely a need to keep coaching people through that, really. There's a lot of us supporting each other a lot.
I just wanted to ask about that kind of 3 thing of mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, because I've been kind of grappling with it in my head a little bit around like places like Pakistan. There's so many people have lost their homes, such an urgent need for huge adaptation and loss and damage payment. But then I also think of that map of 3-degree world, and big parts of Pakistan are unlivable, and I just think I don't know, I'm like, how are we going to, is it just a case of throwing money, rebuilding, a few years later everything gets destroyed again, throwing money, rebuilding, and I also see, I was looking at this problem as a very, I'm very privileged. I haven't lost my home. If I lost my home, I might feel differently about it. I'm just looking as a kind of observer and thinking, is this not a bit crazy but then what options does Pakistan have? Anyway, I just thought I'd share that kind of inner conflict.
There's a recognition, and it is really clear there's something you can't adapt to already. So if your house is close to sea level, you're not going to be able to protect that. Ultimately, we don't know the timescale on melting, by the way. That's one of the real unknowns about timing. We just know that we've basically committed to a lot of melting, so your grandchildren wouldn't have that house, let's say. So some parts of Pakistan, the country I know quite well, you have nowhere where you can rebuild your school above the flood level. There's ways that you could adapt your construction to cope with the next flood. All the areas which were flooded in Pakistan, almost all of them, are the fertile areas. You're not going to have people move away from those areas. So some adaptation would include kind of resilience where you just expect to be flooded and cope again. You have better warning systems. If you're talking about unlivability because of high temperatures, probably within a generation, parts of Pakistan will be unlivable. I think that's clear to me. So then you're looking at a similar situation to an island nation, a low-lying island nation. You say, well, within a generation, our people can't be on the land where we've grown up. We'll have to be in some part of New Zealand or some bit of Fiji that's uphill or something. And that's part of the negotiation. It's part of how we need to both face what's happening and say, well, still we could reduce it from being worse than this level. Definitely. Yeah, and also in that, having just completed the work with local homes on adaptation and looking at the climate that we experience in Western Scotland, it's got significantly worse, and yet we haven't really had a proper disaster in Glasgow. Well, thank God for that. But last year over in Angus, there was a really serious flood, and how many people? About 3 or 4 people died. Several of those houses. There's really no point, in my opinion, in rebuilding some of the estates, because no matter how high you build those particular protections. So, but there's parts of England which are facing that at the moment. Flooded, I think 7 times in 2 years or something with the Severn Valley. So that's something we do need to face. But it feels a little bit, living here, it doesn't feel as immediate as if you were in Pakistan, or actually if you were in parts of Gloucestershire, which have been flooded repeatedly by, obviously, this is climate change. Yeah.
I think just on that, you know, that over the last couple of weeks, there's been a bit more perhaps on BBC or various things about the climate thing, but there's still this kind of thing being projected by the locals. Oh, we should have been given better warning, we should have had better, you know, flood defences, rather than maybe looking at bigger picture, you know.
Yeah.
And then you don't necessarily want a cataclysmic event, but would it take a cataclysmic event to, you know, bring people to their senses?
Right. So cataclysmic events is a really interesting psychology, because all many climate activists think, oh, this one will finally show them. Now we're going to take it seriously. So it just doesn't happen, does it? That said, I think parts of the United States have come to that. There's a lot of houses for sale in Florida now, apparently, because you can't insure them anymore. Ultimately, the insurance company is really what determines whether you can keep your home. And Valencia. I read a figure about 139,000 cars were destroyed in that flood in Valencia. That's what, several billion euros already. So it's not going to be easy to bounce back from that. By the way, it's really unlikely we could get that in Glasgow. Just so you know, that isn't the kind of flood we're going to get here, because it's just the way that the weather systems work. We will get floods, but not that kind of. So, you know. But there, the real problem was the warnings in terms of loss of life. They could have got away with 4 or 5 dead, I would say. Instead, they're away with 200, and it's because of the stupidity of that particular incoming government. So this kind of unreality, like the Saudis, you know, come on, it won't be that bad. No, it can be, and ultimately it's going to be worse than what we've yet had. That's the very nature of it. It's able to give you more than you've had up to now. Yeah.
Sorry, slightly different question. Going back to the finance thing that you were mentioning with the 1.3 trillion, was there any discussion of debt forgiveness as part of that? Because most of these countries are paying massive IMF loans. Right,
well, that's part of the Bridgetown Initiative kind of thinking, which is our Barbados PM, Mayor Motley, the corruption lady, right, is how ridiculous if you've just had a hurricane come through and you're still expected to pay your regular payments on your international loans. Because a hurricane can put you back by 15 years. So that isn't, I don't believe there's anything around that in this text. I'm not sure, because I haven't read every single bit of it. It's the sort of thing that gets discussed and offers, but can we do this? That's it back. Ultimately, I'm hoping that these things take ages, right? But I'm hoping that individual loans and arrangements will actually have better provisions for that sort of thing. For example, one of the answers on that is if you've had a disaster coming through beyond a certain threshold, you should be able to have special drawing rights, like borrow more money for that period, and a period of grace, maybe 2 years, when you don't have to continue with your repayments. So those are quite clever ideas. They've been kind of worked out quite well over the last few years since she started really working on this. I'm hoping that a lot of those will go into place. And I think this is a sensible thing to do.
She's called Maya
Motley. Yeah, so Prime Minister of Barbados. She's the one. If you want a bit of a summary, then go to the where you can look her up. But the podcast I mentioned earlier, Optimism and Outrage. She did one probably about a year ago, and she summarises lots of the aspects of it. And it's moved on since then. Yeah.
What are you going to do next? You know, I mean, you've come to talk to us. Are you talking to other groups, or are you doing some other sort of research? Or
so I'm exhausted.
You're gonna have a holiday.
I'll tell you what, but in the run up to a COP, my email traffic goes from a few tens a week to hundreds a week. So it's a combination now of this sort of thing, feeding back. I haven't got anything else booked in just now, actually. Writing to the various people enabled me to get there. Following up with the various people that we had in our group, and that to me is a very important pastoral role now that I have. I'm going to attend some of their talks virtually, that sort of thing. And then getting the ball rolling for next year, because I think, in terms of having a similar program in Brazil, it's a freer country. You can actually do processes. There's lots of accommodation we're going to try and set up, and various groups going. So I have that in my mind of how can we build for a successful program of what we do within the big deal of next year's COP. Also, just constantly reading and listening to people's digestions of what's been going on. If you want recommendations, I would always go to Carbon Brief. They're quite technical, but they simplify it enough. That's really good. Carbon Brief. Chatham House produces things every now and then. Again, that's not too complicated, but does tell it like it is. And then there's the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. Who report on every one of the negotiations. So we've just done a report on the plastics treaty, and they'll do one on this week's desertification one. They do daily updates and so on. And that, to get your head around what's actually going on, is really, really interesting. If anyone finds one, I'm always looking out for insider stories of how COPs work. It's just fascinating how individual relationships do or don't work, and how you actually get things over the line. For example, the Paris Agreement, finally agreed, printed out, ready for people to sign, and somebody notices that it says shall instead of should. Or no, it says should instead of shall, and should is more binding than shall. So they go around with a pen and cross it out, and everyone can sign it. But those sort of details of how you very nearly lose things. And honestly, this year, I feel like we very nearly went backwards a long way. It's a desperate shame. We need to move forwards, but at least that kind of blocking didn't succeed. Okay.
What will happen after Brazil? Will it go on from there?
Oh, well, we haven't agreed the next locations. After Brazil, it's either going to be Turkey or Australia. And neither side have withdrawn their proposals, obviously. And then you're back into the cycle running up to the next global stocktake, which is the year afterwards. And then the next round of NDCs, which will be 5 years after, so that'll be 2030. In all these things, there's so many other things also went on in this COP. They agreed the carbon trading mechanism, which was in the Paris Agreement 2015, so 9 years on, they finally agreed how they'd do that. There were several other things which were achieved, but some of them were outside of UNFCCC. It's just as they happened to be together, they were able to agree things. And it was also really heartening after the last few years to see the UK effectively a leader actually in the climate space. And the announcement of the NDC, the fact that Miliband kept coming back, he came back for the last few days, really, really helped, but it was a real kind of push against the headwinds of it.
But where are the UK NDCs at the moment?
Oh yeah, we just announced ours will be 81% on 1990 levels by 2035, which is ambitious. They're going to have to do a lot on home heating and a lot on surface transport.
So tell me that again, 81%?
81% on 1990 levels.
On 1990, okay. By
By 2035, yeah.
And we think we're going to get there by cutting home heating emissions.
Yeah,
in
the two,
transport.
well, there's three biggies.
Mm.
We've done electricity effectively, but I'll just keep going.
Yes.
So home heating, get rid of gas.
Yeah.
So that's all going to be heat pumps, in my opinion. That's nothing else really. Some district heating systems, yeah, but obviously. Surface transport, so that's 25% of our emissions are lorries and cars, and that's now doable. Even long distance trucks, they are just coming through very, very quickly now. And the economics of that's enormously beneficial because fuel is the biggest part of trucking. So that I'm sure will be there in 10 years' time. Actually, most of our long distance trucks will be big batteries, and they have to stop every 4 hours anyway. So we're going to charge them. Not so simple, but it's there. EVs. I mean, I drove up from the Midlands today in a petrol car. Well, I would love to have done it in an EV. Soon enough, we'll have a long distance EV for ourselves. They're available. We just haven't got one. And then industrial processes, and there's a lot of amazing breakthroughs in industrial processes, including even cement. So if you go back 10 years ago, these were called hard to abate, iron and steel, cement, aviation is still difficult, and shipping. Well, really, cement is doable, it just needs to be scaled up now. Amazing technologies on that. Iron and steel, all the pilot projects are oversubscribed because people want, there's a certain market for green steel, and the technology now works well. We're not going to have to use coke to produce iron ore. So that's doable, but still, still a lot of steps there. But that's within sight, whereas 10 years ago, it wasn't. Yeah, but those are the three.
Yeah.
Essentially done. That's still on the way.
There isn't any move to bring aviation and shipping into country emissions or anything.
Yeah, it's so different. It's one of those it's not hard to abate. It's hard to get into the negotiations because where do you buy your fuel if one country does it first?
But surely aviation could be assigned to the country of origin of the flight, I would have thought. I mean, that's
yes,
pretty logical.
I would have thought so too.
Yeah.
It's a big lobby.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we didn't get it in earlier on, so.
And you're not a fan of carbon capture, I presume,
Okay, so I'm not a fan of carbon capture. At the end of the day, we will have to do some CDR, some removal. I mean, gosh, I would be fully supportive of every bit of research to speed that up because we could do with less. Obviously, it seems to give a free ride to ongoing emissions, so that's one of the stupid conundrums. But we will have we would be well placed to do as much CDR, that's removal, as possible. CCS, no one's yet managed to make it work.
Yeah.
Is it worth spending large sums of money to try again? I don't really know. I don't know. So we have put a lot of money into that. I understood actually that that's not all public money. It's a lot of it is guarantees rather than grants. But we'll see.
The other possibility is geoengineering, also in development.
Okay, geoengineering. Another risk, yes, often used as a way of just saying we can keep emitting for a bit longer because we can fix it. I'm sure Elon Musk will have ideas on geoengineering. Other than shading the planet externally, I don't like any geoengineering I've heard of. I don't like that one either. But putting significant reflectors in space, maybe, because then it stops getting in. But as soon as you're spraying stuff in the atmosphere, which is the main proposal, I think that's just bonkers. I'm not saying it wouldn't work, but the consequences are so multiple. And as soon as you stop being able to do it, then you can have a big thermal shock. So, right. Well, I
I
think
should say thank you. I think.
Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
Really, really brilliant.
I would just say, I think the way we get through this is by working together as much in community as possible, as much helping each other as possible. I think sharing knowledge and helping our neighbours and communities to take the difficult steps, which seem difficult, but in the end, they're given us warm house. That is what I see here, and I'm thrilled to see it, as well as campaigning and writing to your MPs and everything else. Yes. So I think that's the way we get through this, is by working together as much as we can. So well done.
Thank you. Thank you
very much.
Keep going.
Thank you, everybody.
Say,